Hi, everybody. So, yeah, like Michelle said, my name is James Gibb. I am a biological anthropologist, and a visiting scholar in the Department of Health and Society. And today, I'm gonna, hopefully, you're gonna come on this journey with me, exploring how we can glean some insights about the growth process underlying supposed differences in height and weight and other anthropometric indicators by sexual orientation. And just to kind of, I originally was going to discuss some research related to skeletal growth, skeletal health, but I kind of did I've been working on a bit of a recent analysis. And so these are some preliminary kind of an exploratory data analysis that should be taken with a grain of salt. And an alternative kind of title for my talk would be the socioeconomic and psychosocial factors moderate sexual orientation-based differences in limb proportion and body composition among American adults. And just to kind of locate myself within in relationship to this topic, I'm gay, and so this is kind of a very personal topic to me. And so because obviously one of my research tends to be, I'm interested in how discrimination impacts people's health. And in particular, how it impacts people's physical health and how what kind of processes are contributing to those health disparities. So a brief outline, we'll start out with discussing kind of the relationship and history of anthropometry and sexual orientation. And then we'll go into the kind of what factors have been kind of attributed to those two supposed differences by sexual orientation in terms of anthropometry, followed by kind of a brief discussion about the kind of a biocultural approach to LGBT health disparities. Followed by, as well as a kind of discussion on what is growth and what actually does it reflect in terms of as an indicator, what do these indicators reflect? And then I'll talk about the hypothesis, methods, and kind of results of this preliminary analysis with a discussion and kind of focus on the implications for health and society, and I'll kind of close off with conclusions and kind of ideas for next steps. So generally speaking, so there's kind of this body of research that I came across when I was a graduate student in a growth and development class. I kind of just very briefly in a Google Scholar looked at basically Googled the growth, development, physical anthropometry, and sexual orientation, and I found a variety of papers, largely discussing how largely this body of research examining biological, it stems out of like the arena that examines the biological mechanisms contributing to development of sexual orientation in humans, and they often report morphological differences in what they term sex dimorphic traits between heterosexuals and homosexuals. And I added the kind of quotes for emphasis and also to acknowledge that these aren't my terms. I tend to like to follow like GLAAD's media reference guide when talking about sexual minorities, just because of the kind of baggage and problematic history with the term homosexual, and I certainly don't necessarily identify as a homosexual. But generally, the kind of reports from this literature suggest that compared to heterosexual men, gay men are reported to have a more feminine phenotype, i.e. Shorter stature. And then compared to heterosexual females, lesbian women are reported to have a more masculine phenotype reflected in their greater height. And then the kind of mechanisms that explain these differences largely stem out of kind of the prenatal androgen hypothesis, which is the idea that sexual orientation, like sexual differentiation of the brain and body and other tissues, is the result of individual differences in exposure to prenatal sex steroids, specifically androgens. And so this idea kind of espouses the notion that if fetal androgen exposure, if you're exposed to a higher dose of androgen prenatally, you're more likely to develop a gynophilic orientation, i.e. being attracted to females, and that there are a number of kind of phenotypic or physical correlates associated with that phenotype, such as having a more robust or masculine phenotype, such as a taller stature and having more lean mass, less adiposity, and potentially a later timing of pubertal onset. Conversely, like if you're exposed to lower androgen exposure, you'll develop an androphilic orientation, which is i.e. you'll be attracted to males, and you'll have a more gracile physical form, such as that would be associated with shorter stature and more fat mass. So your body composition would be more akin to what anthropometrists and oxologists would term a gynoid fat distribution. So greater distribution of fat on your limbs, peripherally, such as on your limbs, than centrally on your abdomen. And so when I heard this kind of idea and this hypothesis, I didn't really buy it. And this is coming out of kind of my training as a biocultural anthropologist, and also like in human growth biology, in that a lot of the data suggests that a lot of the authors write about how adult height is the stable trait that is relatively stable after pubertal onset, and how it is a fairly good indicator of sex steroid exposure, which I don't buy. And one of the reasons I don't buy this is because in a 2004 paper on looking at various proportions of the body, Martin and Nugent found that trunk length didn't differ between gay men and heterosexual men, and lesbian women and heterosexual women, but leg length did. And the reason I think this is important to understand is because there's most population variability in height often results out of environmental factors. And in particular, your legs are actually more sensitive to these ecological stressors than your trunk. And that has to do with something I'll talk a little bit later, but this just kind of discusses the history of, or showcases kind of history of anthropometry and sexual orientation. And we see kind of the first paper emerge in 1937, or around 1937. I think there were a couple of German papers that I wasn't able to get access to, and kind of increased even up to this day. And there's a number of kind of characteristics about this arena of research. Often it's very typological. It tends to look at trying to, I guess, search out a physical type, assigned via measurement. They largely rely on cross-sectional samples to make inferences about individuals' growth and thus and development. They have relatively small sample sizes. They often disregard bisexuals. You'll often see sexual orientation treated as a binary in this arena of research, where gay men are one end, or lesbian and gays are one end, and heterosexuals are the other. There's a number of papers that kind of conflate gender identity with sexual orientation. And I find that kind of that is a little problematic, because they'll often term transgender women as being homosexual males, when in fact I don't think that process is what is actually going on. And I don't think that those should be included in these types of analysis, because I think it's important to treat gender identity and sexual orientation separately. And they often commonly rely on self-report, and they use putative indicators of kind of prenatal factors, such as like your digit ratio, I'll just go back to the previous slide, your 2D, 4D digit ratio, which is a ratio between your index and ring finger. And that suggests a degree of kind of masculine prenatal exposure to androgens. And then they often use non-representative convenience samples derived from clinics. But so when I see this, when I hear about differences in adult anthropometry, I actually don't see them as being reflective of a prenatal condition. I think of them as largely being the result of potentially postnatal exposure to adverse social adversity. And this is kind of coming out of biocultural anthropology, which kind of espouses how human biology and health are affected by such factors as the control, production, and distribution of resources, ideology, and power. And also kind of dovetailing off that is the idea of how violating cultural norms can become physiologically costly, in that if you are perceived to violate a cultural norm, say, i.e. what is acceptable sexual behavior, you'll often be stigmatized, and that the stigma attached to that, and the kind of stigma attached to kind of the perception that you are violating a cultural norm has consequences for individuals' health. And on the right is kind of a graphic from Rob Paul Jester, from publication written by Rob Paul Jester, just kind of outlining how minority status can often increases exposure to distal and proximal minority stresses. It's kind of showcasing the physiological process underpinning minority stress hypothesis, which is the idea of how minority groups are more likely to be exposed to stress and that stress takes a toll chronically, resulting in adverse health outcomes. And so collectively, sexual and gender minority people who comprise a diverse group of equity-seeking communities that are often left out of research policy and infrastructure are actually known to be exposed to quite a bit of stress and have a number of existing physical and mental health adverse disparities in terms of mental and physical health outcomes. And in one of Eric and I's recent papers, we kind of showcased how skeletal health might be one of those outcomes associated with higher exposure to minority stress because of the lower bone mineral density values that we found among gay men, and its relation how depression predicted was a significant predictor for that outcome. And so basically this diagram just showcases how the kind of exposure to these stresses results in kind of the stress process taking up, whereby it'll elevate your HPA axis, will upregulate the circulation of cortisol because it believes because it perceives a threat and needs to be in a kind of fight or flight response. Cortisol over time often chronic exposure to cortisol has a number of physiological consequences, such as it will decrease bone mineral density because it's meant to free up the amino acids in your skeletal tissue, but over time that will obviously degrade bone health. And so during the growth process, this can actually cause has consequences for individuals' growth, and so you would see that reflected in kind of differences in limb length. And so that's kind of gets back onto the next slide, which is kind of just talking about what is growth, what does it reflect, and what does it indicate. In terms of postnatal growth, growth is a quantitative increase in size or mass, and it's also heterochronic, which means different parts of the body grow at different rates at different times. In particular, it tends to have there's this idea of the thrifty phenotype hypothesis, which discusses how basically parts of the body with greater functional significance tend to have more their growth tends to be more stable, and also tends to occur more early on in development. So for example, length in trunk, because it's associated with your axial skeleton, which is your skull and trunk, tends to grow and has a more stable growth trajectory than, say, limb growth. And that has all to do with its functional significance in terms of protecting the body and your organs inside of you. Same with the hands. Hands are important, obviously, as humans. We need them to manipulate tools, and they were really important for our evolution. And so what happens then is that limb length tends to be sacrificed if there's any type of environmental stressor. And thus linear growth in limbs tends to be indirectly reflect environmental quality. And that's actually why we see what causes most population variation in adult stature is actually not due to anything going on in the trunk. It's actually often the result of environmental factors impacting growth and development, and that will be reflected in often in shorter leg lengths or limb lengths. And so for a really great example of this is coming out of Barry Bogan's work, where he shows that the Maya actually have their trunks are the same as American kids, but they have shorter legs. And that all has to do with the kind of political economic factors that they're exposed to during their growth. Which has consequences for their health. And the kind of diagram on the left, on the right, sorry, just showcases the heterochronic nature of growth, where we see like stature. Most gains in adult stature, such in standing height, actually occur postnatally, in particular after puberty, the onset of puberty. And so, unlike what is often perceived as it being a relatively stable trait, it's actually your height is actually often indicative of the quality of your postnatal environment and the environment that you grew up in. So often, shorter adult stature is going to be suggestive of some kind of environmental insult. and thus, especially if there's a difference in limb length, as I previously mentioned. So that's kind of why I don't buy it. And we know as kind of as public health researchers and health scholars that, you know, I'm sure many of you have heard about the chronic rates of bullying, or higher experience, the great more, apologies, that sexual minorities are more likely to experience adverse childhood and have negative experiences during adolescence and childhood. In particular, they're more likely to get bullied. And I'm really interested in how those negative experiences impacts their growth. In particular, because that has important health implications. For example, it could interfere with the attainment of peak bone mass, which will then augment their risk for osteoporosis later in life. So from this kind of idea, I'm going to kind of explore two hypotheses. The minority stress hypothesis it kind of discusses how social adversity causes stress for minority individuals, which accrues over time, resulting in long-term health deficits. And from this hypothesis, I would predict that body composition and proportion will be associated with socioeconomic and psychosocial factors, such as elevated severity of depression or household income. And that age of menarche will be earlier among females, sexual minority females relative to heterosexual females, because we know that in the literature, often female girls who are exposed to greater kind of stress during development often have an earlier age of maturation. That kind of has to go into life history theory, which we don't need to talk about right now. And that anthropometric indicators of adverse health outcomes will be concentrated among those groups that are experience the most social stigma attached to their sexual identity. And that will be we'll see that around specifically among bisexuals. And then conversely, on the flip side, the prenatal androgen hypothesis discusses how, is the idea that sexual orientation, like sexual differentiation, results from individual differences in exposure to prenatal sex steroids. And thus, what we would see then in terms of prediction is that I would predict that sexual minority individuals, their pattern of body proportion and composition will be skewed toward that of their heterosexual cisgender counterparts. And that sexual minority females will have a later age of menarche, because it would be associated for some reason with a more male type pattern of development, or a more masculine pattern of pubertal onset. And that between group heterogeneity will largely reflect a gradient from heterosexual to lesbian gay, and that will be suggestive of androgen exposure. And to investigate this, I use data I combine 4 waves of NHANES data, and I group participants using sexual behavior and identity. I group participants in 4 groups: participants who reported identifying as gay as lesbian, regardless of sexual behavior history. And then we're grouped as 1, 2, participants who identified as bisexual, regardless of sexual behavior history. 3 were participants reporting a heterosexual identity, but engaged in same-sex sexual behavior. And then 4 were exclusively heterosexual individuals who reported a heterosexual identity. And so the sample of adults had a mean age of 38 years, between 18 and 59. And I had about 216 lesbian gays, 364 bisexuals, 417 same-sex experienced individuals, and 11,000 heterosexuals. So these were the independent, the variables I'm interested in my analysis, which were standing height, weight, upper leg length, which would be an indirect measure of limb growth and nutritional status. Upper arm length, which is also would be another indirect measure of limb growth and nutritional status. Mid-upper arm circumference, which would be an indirect measure of both fat and muscle mass in the arm. And then tricep and subscapular skin folds, which are an indirect measure of adiposity. And then waist circumference, which would be another indirect measure of central adiposity. Using these, I calculated a number of indices to kind of get a better idea of body composition among my sample. So I didn't calculate body mass index because it's super easy to do, but NHANES did, and it's just calculated as kilograms divided by meters squared. And it's an indirect measure of overall adiposity. And then central pedal fat ratio is an indirect measure of central abdominal adiposity. And it's also tends to be a more android pattern of fat distribution. So it's a more, i.e. masculine pattern of fat distribution. Then I also use the skin folds and mid-upper arm circumference to calculate arm fat area, arm muscle area, and arm muscle circumference. And I included a number of covariates in my kind of analysis, such as age, household income, household size, education, depression, adult food security status, HIV, and age at menarche. In terms of the analysis, all the analysis were done in R. ANOVAs or crucible Wallace tests were used to assess differences between sexual orientation and body composition. Sexual orientation and anthropometric variables. And then I also ran a couple of regressions to look at the kind of potential predictors. I'm not going to be reporting actually all my p-values because this is largely very exploratory right now, and it's very preliminary. And so I'm still kind of working out the kinks in my regression models. But hopefully once I get this published, you'll be able to read the paper. So in terms of results, I'm just going to speak more to general patterns. And the general pattern that we see in terms of limb proportion among among the female participants is that we actually see kind of we don't actually see anything statistically significant. Superficially, we see that sexual minority women might have a taller stature and longer limbs, but I don't think these statistics aren't necessarily kind of statistically significant in the kind of ANOVAs or the KW tests. Although in terms of limb length, we do, and it's actually, we don't actually see a difference between lesbians and heterosexual females. We see a difference between bisexuals, same-sex experience are actually taller relative to the heterosexual females, which I think is really interesting. And that kind of also kind of parallels kind of research that Eric Shattuck and I did in our recent publication, which suggested that sexual minority women had the values of their bone mineral density values were stronger or higher than heterosexual females, suggesting they had basically stronger bones potentially. And then in terms of body composition, what we do see is what's I think really interesting is that we don't actually see less fat among sexual minorities. In terms of distribution of adiposity, we actually see a more feminine pattern of adiposity distribution among the sexual minority females than we do the heterosexual females. And this just kind of showcases the kind of concentrations of kind of who's in terms of BMI categories by sexual orientation in females. We see, that sexual minority females are more likely to have a BMI that's over 30 than heterosexuals, and there was also kind of statistically significant differences in terms of waist circumference as well as BMI. And the majority of heterosexuals tend to be in the below or kind of overweight range. And then in terms of males, and this is just age of menarche, and we actually see a fairly an earlier age of menarche. And all of my just FYI, my plots were all log transformed, just because I find that makes them look nicer. But there was a statistically significant difference in terms of age at menarche, with sexual minority females having an earlier age at menarche than heterosexual females. And I need to fix this kind of plot because there's a couple outliers that are probably making things messy. And then in terms of the study sample males, what we find is actually quite interesting. In terms of limb proportion, we find gay males have shorter limbs, shorter upper arm lengths than other sexual orientation groups, and that despite having an overall taller stature. And that kind of same-sex experienced individuals and heterosexual individuals exhibit longer upper arm lengths but shorter upper leg lengths than sexual minorities, and that bisexuals and gay men exhibit taller standing height but reduced measures of upper arm length. So, but there's overall little variation in stature that is statistically significant, although the upper arm lengths are statistically significant. And then in terms of body composition, what we see is that we do not find a more feminine pattern of body composition among sexual minorities than we do heterosexuals. What we find is that actually the most part, we see a reduced pattern of body composition characteristic of sexual minorities is reduced relative to heterosexuals, so they are less fat. They have their waist circumference tends to be lower, and their body mass index they're more likely to be underweight than their relative to their peers. Although bisexuals, there's a little bit more variation, which might be related to their experiences of stigma. And this again kind of just showcases that same slide, but with the BMI breakdown. And we can see that gay men are far more likely they have a higher concentration of being below weight than their peers, and that bisexuals actually are more likely to be overweight than their peers, or obese. Sorry, 30, anyways. And so kind of in terms of the regressions, I'll just basically cover some of the factors that were predictive. And in terms of for females, education, mild depression, and non-US citizenship and age at menarche were associated with upper arm length in females. Education, household income, and moderate depression and non-US citizenship and age at menarche were associated with upper leg length in females. And then in terms of height, we see education, household income, non-US citizenship, and mild to moderate severe depression, as well as a bisexual sexual identity were associated with waist circumference among females. And then for males, we have education, which is a proxy which I'm using as a proxy for early life SES. Non-US citizenship, a gay sexual identity were associated with upper arm lengths. And then education, household income, non-US citizenship, severe depression, and a gay sexual identity were associated with lower leg lengths. And then waist circumference was largely attributed to education, household income, non-US citizenship, and mild to moderate depression among males. So just having a discussion, an overview of kind of the hypothesis are that sexual minorities exhibit a pattern of limb proportion that is much more suggestive of exposure to greater sensitivity to environmental stressors, such as the kind of socioeconomic psychosocial variables. Sexual minority males do not exhibit a sexually dimorphic skewed pattern of body composition towards that would be more consistent or more comparable, would be closer to their cisgender heterosexual female counterparts. Rather, anthropometric indicators suggest that sexual minority males exhibit a more masculine phenotype. They actually have overall less adiposity, although there is still some variation in terms of bisexual adiposity. I think that actually would be suggestive of related to the greater likelihood of kind of seeing elevated health disparities among sexual minorities, among bisexuals, than relative to other sexual minorities. And then in terms of females, sexual minority females do not exhibit a sexually dimorphic pattern of body composition or proportion. Rather, their anthropometric indicators largely suggest a more feminine pattern or phenotype. They have greater kind of adiposity, which we know is largely associated with, adiposity tends to be very sexually dimorphic. We see more lean mass among males, more adipose tissue among females. And I think kind of what's really interesting is the factors that are is the early age of menarche that that females are exhibiting, and that what might be going on in there, but also the results for the females also are stronger in terms of support for the minority stress hypothesis rather than the kind of androgen hypothesis. And this is, although limb proportion among females was strongly associated with, and that's largely because limb proportion among females was strongly associated with socioeconomic and social variables, and there was no kind of significant, and sexual orientation wasn't significant in those models. And then earlier age of menarche. What's really interesting though is kind of the early age of menarche that we see among sexual minorities, because normally, in the literature, it's usually associated with a shorter adult stature. So that's kind of worth going to look into a little bit more. And then, so this kind of just so when I think, again, kind of in terms of the implications of this research, when I think about what influences growth and development, there is, there's a lot of postnatal factors that are going to contribute to differences in stature and other kind of anthropometric indicators, such as, stress, nutrition, disease, toxicants, and the physical environment, right? And these are all going to be structured by the more distal factors, such as like the socio-political and economic climate an individual grows up in, their culture, and the kind of ecology that that they're surrounded by. And these are all going to kind of impact like the resources that are available and energy that is able to be invested into the growth of various tissues. And so what I think is important to think about, what I actually think is going on and what we're seeing with this data is actually, rather than there's actually having to do anything with sexual orientation, other than how sexual orientation structures exposure to deleterious, adverse social experience, rather what it's showing us is kind of heightened, like it's, I don't know how to say this, but like it's, what we're seeing is a kind of concentrated effect in terms of sex differences, environmental sensitivity. So males are often more sensitive to ecological and social adversity and how it impacts them biologically than females. And there's some ideas behind this about it being related to testosterone, how costly testosterone is as a kind of molecule or as a kind of biochemical compound. And how the kind of immunocompromising effects of testosterone. But what I think we're seeing in the data in terms of why we would see differences in limb length among males, but not necessarily females, is actually because, we know that males tend to be more vulnerable to these socio-ecological factors, and that this vulnerability is being exacerbated by stigma associated with individuals' sexual orientation. And that stigma is what is kind of driving, is kind of what is the kind of underlying cause of this pattern in the sexual orientation pattern. It's really not anything to do with sexual orientation other than how it exposes people to stigma, but rather it has a lot more to do with just the differences in kind of sex differences in life history strategy that we see between the sexes, and as well as the kind of physiological differences that result in the greater sensitivity of males to environment, to ecological stressors than females. And it has to do with, females are biologically tend to be thought of as more important because they're actually they're important because of like reproduction. And so evolution has resulted in kind of a more resilient phenotype for females. That's kind of associated with why we see greater adiposity in females, because it's a greater reserve in energy and that they can kind of fall back on for when they're pregnant, but also for growth and development. And so the implications for health and society, I suppose, is like if we're seeing growth in limb proportion largely occurs after puberty. And I think what we know is that, there's really great statistics on LGBTQ youth experiences with adversity during childhood and adolescence now. And that they're more likely to experience bullying, harassment, and physical violence relative to heterosexuals. And so how does that actually affect their growth and development? 55% of LGBT youth say they feel unsafe in schools because of their sexual orientation. Now, that stress is going to not just going to be located in their psychology. It's also going to have a physiological component to it as well. And that physiological component, depending on the chronic nature of it, could potentially impact their health and potentially their growth. So how does this stress impact LGBT youth's growth? And this is kind of something I'm hoping to be able to explore further in my PhD, and kind of looking at different biomarkers for bone turnover and their relationship to psychosocial factors among LGBT youth. But I do think that this is really what we're seeing what is contributing to these differences rather than anything to do with a prenatal condition. And I think what's really important is that, for this line of research, researchers should really take caution in assigning a prenatal factor as causative without a full investigation of the growth process. And this largely is because, human growth takes, humans don't, the ends of your bones don't fuse until you're often until your mid-20s, right? And so you have the potential to grow up until you're 25. And so without actually considering the various factors associated with within that kind of, sorry. So assuming adult phenotypic characteristics to be the result of prenatal hormone exposure, without considering the entirety of the growth process, not only misunderstands human life course biology, but also runs a risk of pathologizing human sexual diversity as an outcome of prenatal androgen disorders. So rather, what I'm suggesting then as androgen exposure hypothesis is that what we see is, when considered from minority stress framework, sexual orientation-based differences in body proportion and composition is better understood as the embodied health outcomes of experiencing discrimination and stigma during development. And the kind of preliminary findings preliminary analysis I just presented to you is more consistent. The interpretation of this data is more consistent with previous oxological research that demonstrates the influence of postnatal environmental conditions on within and between population differences in growth in adult anthropometry. And I would say that investigators interested in unraveling sexual orientation differences in anthropometric characteristics should draw on the extensive literature documenting the social and environmental factors shaping variability in human growth. And in particular, they should be making use of longitudinal cohort data rather than make speculative inferences on cross-sectional samples about the causes of sexual orientation differences in physical characteristics. And this is kind of where I see, as a biological anthropologist and biologist, can really make a substantial contribution in affirming the kind of biological normalcy of persons of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities, really by kind of taking on a lot of the speculative hypotheses that have been produced by other disciplines and assessing how well they stand up in regards to cross-culturally and in various sociopolitical and socio-ecological contexts. And so, you know, basically that is the end of my talk. That's my little soapbox. And so I would like to thank a number of my colleagues, Jessica Fields, Eric Shattuck, Leila McKinnon, Casper Sminkelston, Lucy Jarrett McCharacter, Sarah Williams, my master supervisor, Michael Scalacci, my colleagues, Amy Bersheim, Corey Sparks, Lori Ross, Ali Gray, and Jada Charles, as well as the Department of Health Society, for inviting me to talk today, and the various research groups I am part of. Thank you.